The last time we were together in Giza, we left on these images of a corridor that led us to the Sphinx. And today, it's precisely the Sphinx that will be the subject of the video. So, welcome everyone to this new episode dedicated to the age of the Sphinx. Today we're going to take a closer look at the erosion marks that are present on its body, the erosion marks that are present on the perimeter surrounding the Sphinx. Perimeter, in which we came to dig and extract the blocks that then compose the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple. We're also going to linger a little bit on the head, not only its shape, but its size, the various inconsistencies and questions that this can raise, while also taking a little step back to see historically which authors have already talked about the Sphinx in an alternative way, by addressing the rather thorny issue, not only of its age, but also of the pharaoh it is supposed to represent. So without further ado, I invite you to join me in this video and accompany me for the next few minutes, to provide a comprehensive overview of the Sphinx, compared to what we can see and think when we visit this magnificent monolithic statue in person. While Egypt is often synonymous with pyramids, the mysteries of its past could not be better embodied than by the Sphinx. The hypotheses about the Sphinx form a fabric of approximation so thick that the mystical figure easily reveals the evidence of improbable errors. To understand what is said about the Sphinx, one must backtrack a little and reconstruct the modus operandi that has allowed the conclusions accepted to this day. The size of the Sphinx is generally attributed to Pharaoh Khafra around 2500 before Christ. Yes, when I say size, I mean the size of the rock, not size in the sense of dimension, which by the way are 73.5 meters long by 14 meters wide for a little over 20 meters in height. And regarding the weight of the Sphinx, we are at a weight roughly estimated at 20,000 tons. Aside from the geological and technical considerations that we will address in a moment, we are first of all going to rely on known dynastic achievements to find out whether or not the Sphinx can represent Khafra. For this, it will be enough to compare a representation of the pharaoh present at the Cairo Museum with the head of the Sphinx to note a first incompatibility. If the statue of Khafra, his Egyptian name that is present at the Cairo Museum, is indeed that of Khafra, then the Sphinx cannot be Khafre, and vice versa. The glaring differences observed between the two are admitted by the Egyptologists themselves, but for them it changes nothing. It is indeed the same person. We will be told that, in this specific case, the lack of similarity comes from the unequal skills of the stonecutters who had officiated at the time. This speech from the official ambassadors of a culture known for its perfectionism is somewhat surprising to me. Guided by a respect for values and traditions, I am consistently outraged by the endless renovations on the Sphinx. The goal appears to be mitigating erosion signs and giving it a nice facelift, for the delight of Chinese tourists, whose numbers increase by 10% each year, but this still poses a problem in many respects. The Sphinx is slowly losing its distinctiveness. Then, what I call this facelift tends to give it back an original appearance that we are still unable to draw precisely. We suspect but don't know for certain. Add to this the fact that erosion is not an exclusively external phenomenon. Erosion also affects the inside of the rock. Covering the Sphinx with these bricks would prevent access to potential internal repairs needed for preservation. Let's now continue our walk on the enclosure of the Sphinx from where we notice traces of erosion on the statue as well as on its perimeter. When it was discovered, only its head was sticking out of the sand, observation indicating that the head should have suffered more damage and more erosion than the body which was buried in the sand. However, this is not the case. The question is where the erosion came from and how many years it took to form. The Sphinx was buried in sand when Napoleon studied it, starting from 1798, then when Caviglia did the same, starting from 1816, then Mariette in 1850, and finally Barrezes in 1926. All these people faced the same logistical constraint of mandatory sand removal in order to study on site. And what about the myth of Thutmose IV's dream, whose origins of the rain remain a bit random? This myth of the dream, it is present on a stele and we are going to read it together now. Start of quote. One day, it happened that the royal son Thutmose, who was going for a walk at noon, rested in the shadow of this great god. When the sun was at its zenith, he then realized that the majesty of this god, august god, was speaking to him from his mouth. Even so, like a father speaks to his son, saying, "Look at me, behold me, O my son Thutmose, I am your father, I will give you the royalty on earth. At the head of the living you will wear the white crown and the red crown on the robe of Reb, the prince of the gods. The earth will belong to you in its length and width, and everything that illuminates the bright eye of the master of the universe. Now the sand of the desert torments me, the sand over which I once was. So hurry to me so that you can accomplish everything I desire." And so, this dream, in a nutshell, is to say that the Sphinx told Thutmose, "Uncover me, and you will become pharaoh of the land." So, promised to the throne of the kingdom of Egypt by the Sphinx, in this dream Thutmose had it uncovered. The climate not really having changed. Between 2500 before Christ, the supposed carving date of the Sphinx, and 1400 before Christ, the reign of Thutmose IV, logic suggests that if the Sphinx was covered in sand in 1400 before Christ, it was just as covered 900 years before that. Can we then decently imagine the Egyptians spending the estimated million hours carving the Sphinx in a place as inhospitable as it would have required continuous attention to avoid perpetual sanding? This is in any case what Gaston Maspero, French Egyptologist, confirms. Maspero is the second director of the Cairo Museum, and he wrote in 1886, so it's not from yesterday, that the 13th line of the Sphinx stele contains a cartouche of Khafra, which would indicate the excavations carried out by Prince Khafra before he became king. We can therefore conclude the presence of an already existing and already sand-covered Sphinx in the time of Khafra and his dynastic predecessors. We have here a new element that would invalidate the supposed order by Khafra to carve a Sphinx in his likeness. Another stele, known as the Inventory stele, created by the priests of the 26th dynasty in honor and memory of the dead of the Old Kingdom, lists 22 divine statues. Its legitimacy is nevertheless challenged by official historians, who find many anachronisms in it, among which the contemporary existence of the pyramids and the Sphinx, even before the pharaonic reigns. The shadow of the fake weighs on this document, which could, however, support the other elements that allow us to think that the Sphinx dates back to an as yet unknown era. What if the Sphinx was built before the pharaohs, when the climate of the Giza plateau was entirely different? This is what geology indicates this time, putting us face to face with a new fact that is still rejected by Egyptologists. The sand and wind could not have been the sources of the erosion present on the Sphinx. On the blocks that make up the Sphinx's enclosure, the erosion is not horizontal but indeed vertical. These same traces of erosion are also found on the back of the Sphinx. So we know that its perimeter and body, buried in sand for millennia, both experienced sufficiently recurrent and abundant rainfall to create such marks in the limestone. In short, a very nice stone added to the edifice of the search for its true age. The most solid scientific explanation on this subject comes from Dr. Robert Schoch, a professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the highly esteemed Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. These works have sprouted from the inspiration instilled by John Anthony West, after reading a work by Schwaller de Lubitz, who was the first to mention the presence of water erosion around the Sphinx. Let's start by first quoting Schwaller de Lubitz, who wrote a book in 1961 titled The King of the Pharaonic Theocracy. He claimed that this erosion was due to the desert sand wind. However, the entire body of the Sphinx is protected from all the winds that come from the western desert, the only ones that could cause erosion. Only the head protrudes from this basin, and it shows no erosion. We can admit that a great civilization must have preceded the vast water movements that passed over Egypt, from which came the existence of the Sphinx carved into the rock of the west cliff of Giza. This Sphinx, whose entire leonine body, with the exception of the head, shows undeniable water erosion. End of quote. And now here is what Robert Schoch tells us in relation to this. Start of quote. In 1990 I went to Egypt for the first time, with the sole objective of examining the Sphinx from a geological point of view. I assumed that the dates given by the Egyptologists were correct, but quickly realized that the geological evidence was incompatible with the proposed dates. On the body of the Sphinx and on the enclosure walls, strong signs of erosion are visible, which could only have been created by water flows and precipitation. The region where the Sphinx is located has been known to be arid for over 5,000 years. Moreover, other structures dating from the Old Kingdom show erosion caused by wind and sand. I conclude that the oldest parts of the Sphinx date back to a more distant period, estimated between -5,000 and -9,000, during which the climate allowed for rainfall. Many have risen against me, claiming that it is not possible for the Sphinx to be so old. Its head is clearly that of a pharaoh whose dynasties began in 3200 before Christ. In truth, if you look closer, the head seems awfully small compared to the proportions of the rest of the body. It seems clear to me that the current head is not the original head. If so, it would have the same erosion levels as the rest of the body. Given that this is not the case, the most likely hypothesis is that it was reshaped during the dynastic era.
Besides its appearance,
tiny and underproportioned, the head raises other debates, such as the ethnic origin of the pharaohs. For some years now, Afrocentric movements have claimed to be the sole heirs of the pharaonic aspect of Egyptian history. The morphotypes of Egyptian statues present such a diversity that it is quickly demonstrable that the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa were not the only ones on the lands of Osiris. Despite the displeasure of those who vehemently deny the presence of black African descendants in Egypt, it appears undeniable that the face of the Sphinx has a facial structure that leaves little doubt as to the origins of the pharaoh present here. The numerous broken noses on Egyptian statues indicate that newcomers were displeased with the physical aspect and rejected that part of their heritage. Just go a little further south to the region of Meroe in Sudan to realize that Nubia was once a high societal place and that, consequently, black pharaohs did indeed exist. Frank Domingo, a New York police criminologist physiognomist, compared the Sphinx's profile with Khephr's statue at the Cairo Museum. Using photographic techniques similar to those used in orthodontics, the head of the Sphinx presents a maxillary prognathism, while the statue of Khephr from the Cairo Museum is what is called Proto-European. According to him, the Sphinx represents a person from Black Africa. Returning to the alleged errors mentioned by the academics at the start of the video. In a New York Times article from July 18, 1992, Frank Domingo adds that no artist could be mistaken to the point of creating two such opposing faces of the same person. But what did the Sphinx represent before it was humanized? A lion, a jackal, a pharaoh? Everything has been said about him. Each claimant to the key of the mystery offers a theory backed by text excerpts containing more or less consistent clues. The reality is that all these theories are equal, therefore it is objectively impossible to know who is telling the truth. The only two certainties that remain today are the Sphinx's age differs from the official narrative, and that the head is not the original head, and that it has been reshaped. Whether the Sphinx was Tefnut Anubis, or simply a pharaoh's face with the right proportions, no one can claim to know today. For those discovering these deities, Tefnut is a woman with a lioness's head, with a solar disk on her head, Tefnut being the first female deity to come into existence in the universe. And as for Anubis, he was a funerary god in ancient Egypt, master of the necropolises and protector of embalmers, represented as a large black canine,
lying on his stomach.
When we talk about the reshaping of the head, it's important to understand just a small detail, that it's not about replacing the Sphinx's monoblock with other blocks to recreate a head, but rather to readjust an initially wider head which has become in very poor condition, in favor of a slightly more modest head but with slightly more refined features. While geology allows us to eliminate the periods during which it is not possible that the Sphinx was built, it does not allow us to precisely date its construction. This complex exercise, a researcher tried it by scrutinizing the dust of answers, not under our feet but up there in the stars. This researcher is Robert Bauval, whom you may know. Archaeoastronomy is a field that allows us to know that the ancients had an advanced knowledge of the universe. If the three pyramids of Giza and Teotihuacan are aligned with what is called Orion's belt, it is not by chance. Based on his findings, Mr. Bauval determined the Sphinx to be less than 10,500 years old. With two different methods, two researchers have reached a consensus. The age of the Sphinx dates back to a time much further than we think. Given the numerous indications of equinox and astronomical recurrence described in the sacred architectures of Egyptian temples, the east-facing position of the Sphinx could indicate an equinox marker. Coupled with its shape, close to the lion, it's only a step away from the constellation of the lion, which then becomes a serious line of thought. The link between the two is made using precessional science, a relatively simple concept. The Earth spins on its own axis, we agree on that. The axis around which it spins, however, it oscillates. This oscillation in turn causes a gradual change in the orientation of the axis. Exactly like spinning tops, which start to wobble when their speed begins to decrease. The Earth's oscillation, on the other hand, is caused by the torque exerted by the tidal forces of the Moon and the Sun. This gradual change in the orientation of the axis relative to the stars results in a change in the position of these stars on the visible celestial sphere from Earth. The North Star, the reference point for geographic north, varies depending on the time of observation. In fact, the equinoctial point indicating the direction of the Sun at the spring equinox is also subject to this change of place in the sky. Each year, it slightly precedes its position from the equinox of the previous year and continues this pattern in the following years. Hence the term precession of the equinoxes. The annual shifts in the sky's locations are so tiny that a full precessional cycle takes 26,000 years to complete. Well, 25,760. To be more precise, Egyptian texts demonstrate that the ancients imagined their kingdom as being a terrestrial reflection of the celestial world. Schwaller de Lubitz discusses this in detail in his book The Egyptian Miracle. Convinced that every ground representation has a clear and precise astral connection, Bauval then asked himself the question of when the Sphinx could have watched the constellation of the lion rising in front of him. 10,500 before Christ? For him, the answer is found here. He then looked for other correlations. He then realizes that the three stars of Orion's belt, as I was saying a little earlier in the video and in other videos, are positioned like the three pyramids of Giza. Also, he suggests that the Nile would be the earthly reflection of the Milky Way, as if the builders wanted to represent a map of the sky on the ground. Going back in time, he finds the exact position that the stars of Orion's belt had in relation to the Milky Way, so that they correspond to the position of the Giza pyramids in relation to the Nile. At what period? Look no further, 10,500 years before Christ, like the Sphinx. But in the face of all these dates, it must be kept in mind that, as far as alternative dates are concerned, they are on the same level as those that are officially and conventionally accepted. All of this remains only a supposition as long as the Ministry of Antiquities does not authorize serious geological studies, as Robert Schoch and John Anthony West have wanted to conduct for over 20 years.